Welcome back. It's Swing Pass. I'm Adam Ruffner. That's Daniel Cohen. We're looking ahead to Week 5 action in the AUDL. Just a 7-game slate this weekend, heading into Memorial Day weekend. But there are a slew of really important divisional matchups, starting with the game of the week. The 0-2 Madison Radicals hosting the 0-1 Chicago Union. These two teams have been responsible for 8 of the last 9 Central Division Championship weekend appearances, and yet neither of them have a win so far, heading into the closing weekend of the opening month of the season. So one of these two teams looking to turn themselves around on the biggest stage of Week 5. We'll talk about that game, as well as Chicago's second game of the weekend. They will be going back home on Sunday and hosting the first place Minnesota Wind Chill in an all-important interdivisional matchup. That will be one to watch. We'll also be talking about the Commonwealth Cup, as the Philadelphia Phoenix 0-4 have just suffered some of the most brutal losses in recent memory, heading to take on the 2-1 Pittsburgh Thunderbirds, who are looking to bounce back after a tough road loss in Minnesota this past weekend. Daniel, let's start with the game of the week. Madison has lost both their games this season by 1 goal in the final seconds of regulation. They can't seem to catch a break after years of this franchise seemingly escaping at the buzzer again and again with wins. It's just been, I think, a little bit of a head spin. I was actually on a call earlier today with Evan Lepler and Madison's head coach, Tim DeBile. And DeBile even kind of admitted that there's just a little bit of wariness with this team at the results because they feel like they're playing well. They feel like they're putting themselves into positions to win. And they just kind of keep coming up a little bit shy. And it's starting to have an effect. And so they're looking for that big bounce back win at home. They're going to be having that Breeze Stevens crowd behind them this weekend. It's been gorgeous weather here in Madison all week. I expect it to be just a beautiful night on the peninsula. What are your kind of expectations going into this big tilt between Chicago and Madison on Saturday night?
Yeah, it's hard to know what to expect from Madison at this point because it's like 2 heartbreaking losses is a real demoralizing way to start the season. But this is their first home game. They're also statistically they're performing very well offensively. They have the 6th best offensive efficiency in the league, I believe. They're averaging the 3rd fewest turnovers per game. Granted, they had that indoor game in Indy, so that'll skew numbers a little bit. But overall, I think they've been playing better this year than they have last year and in previous years where offense has been their main issue. It's still early in the season, so it's hard to get a good feel of where they are, like their identity of their offense. But I think the fact that they're playing as well as they are with still a lot of injuries that they're dealing with and some guys they're expecting back later this season, it bodes well for their chances later in the year. But this is like absolutely a must-win game. It's also like an opportunity to make a statement because Chicago, coming off a loss of their own, they did not look great against Indianapolis. And it seems like Chicago's going to be finally beatable this year after being the reigning champs for the past 2 seasons. So I'm interested to see like if Madison can kind of rise to the occasion, get that home crowd mojo back, and get a big win at home.
Yeah. To a couple of your points, I think on offense, it's just been a real return to form for Victor Luo. He actually tore his labrum in week 1, laying out for the disc several times in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
But he has had over 50 touches in each of his first 2 appearances this year. He is the obvious pace setter for the Radicals offense. And as I've written about a couple of times, as we've kind of alluded to, it's a much younger, much more up-tempo looking Radicals offensive endeavor in 2023. Ted Shuey, who has been on this team, I think the past 2 years, if not 3, he looks like a revitalized form of himself. Coach DeBile was talking about how he's made more of an impact as just kind of a vocal leader in practices, taking the team through their sets, kind of calling out the plays. Henry Goldenberg has been playing, I think, in an elevated level this year. And then rookie Anthony Gukowski, who had a team high, and I think actually a game high, was it 6 or 7 goals this past weekend?
6 goals.
It was a red zone presence, kind of like a smaller Babbitt, if you will. He was just continually beating people in small spaces, getting open at that front cone, which I think is becoming a really viable weapon. You know, you think back the past couple of seasons, 2021 Rookie of the Year was Anders Jungst. He has been so good at doing that exact same thing. Jeff Babbitt leads the league in goals this year. That's sort of been his statement. Is what did you get at in this year's Player Chatter article? They want to rename the end zone the Babbitt Zone because of how he's just sort of taken over that box. I think that, you know, Gukowski can be a similar sort of weapon for this Radicals offense, a sort of solution piece at the end of drives. And I think it's something that they've actually lacked a lot the past couple of years. And I don't think that there is any kind of coincidence around the fact that they now have such a simple receiving option to look towards, and suddenly their efficiency numbers are starting to go up just a little bit. So I expect him to have a good performance on Saturday night. I think that Chicago does have some interesting defenders to put on him. Their captain, Jace Brunner, is somebody who I think operates really well in that space. John Jones will be making his 2023 debut, it looks like, according to the active roster report. He has notoriously been great in important matchups, particularly in the fourth quarter. He had 2 huge clutch blocks in 2022 in important Chicago road wins. He could do something similar, I think, in a Breeze Stevens environment where there's just always a little bit of electricity in the air for players to seize if they so choose. I guess what I'm working into is wondering, with both of these teams, maybe due to injuries, due to departures, you know, Madison admittedly has a bunch of their stars currently sidelined in KPS, Sterling Kanaki, a few of their other top defenders. Chicago is working through the pangs of the post-Pavel era that we keep hyping up. But, their first performance, it appears to be real.
Yeah, the post-Pavel era.
This matchup, despite it being one of the oldest and fiercest rivalries, is sort of taking on a new era. And I think it'll be interesting to see sort of who puts their imprint on this matchup. Who is sort of going to be for either team that sort of shield bearer, right? Because the previous iterations aren't there. I mean, KPS has been that the past several seasons for Madison. He's not available. He'll be on the sideline. Pavel's gone. Somebody has to step up into that role. Who do you maybe see elevating into kind of the playmaker for their respective team?
Yeah, it's tough, right? Because both these teams, I mean, coming into this game like last year and the year before, I think it'd be very clear cut that I would say Chicago had the better offense, but it feels weird kind of leaning towards Madison as the team I think will outproduce the other offensively. I just think, like you were mentioning before, all those Madison playmakers in Luo, Goldenberg, Shuey, Gukowski, like all of a sudden they kind of have some firepower and like some explosiveness to the offensive side, which we really haven't seen from them in recent seasons at all. Whereas with Chicago, where I still think they have a lot of those same pieces, and we've talked about their cutting core, like in theory, the Barker, Andrew Sjogren, Jack Shanahan, Nate Goff was playing O-line last week. Paul Arders was playing a center handler role, but like in theory, you could still shift him upfield. That's still like a rock solid, especially like when you talk about continuation, like big play ability, that's a line that can get the job done. There was just such a disconnect in week 1 or whatever, their first game against Indy, week 3, I believe, where, you didn't have Pavel like just kind of running forward through the defense to set up his receivers downfield. No one really took on that responsibility. I look at Sam Kaminsky's absence as like a pretty big one in the Chicago offense because he's been sidelined with a hamstring injury, I believe. I think he's questionable, a game time decision for this weekend against Madison. I think if they can get him back, like they're just going to have to figure out their backfield at this point. Like the Paul Arders center handler experiment, I don't know how long that's going to last after what we saw last time against Indy. I think they've got a few interesting pieces in Wyatt Meckler and Nico Lake, who's back with the team after last playing with them in 2021. So it's going to be some experimentation in that backfield. But if they can like successfully sort of bridge the gap and allow their playmakers downfield to shine, I think that's going to be the key for the Chicago offense.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I thought, Kaminsky's absence in their first game was just evident. They need that kind of ball mover, right? That's how I'm going to refer to kind of the piece that Chicago is missing. They have all these nice weapons, so to speak, these limbs, like you talk about, these playmakers, but when you force starters into a backfield role, you could just see it discontinues the rhythm that was so present for this Union offense the past 2 seasons when they were a top 5, if not 3 most efficient unit in the AUDL. And it's just like you take away that ability to navigate small spaces, ability to navigate really effectively and smoothly out of trap scenarios, stop disc situations where the defense can set up. Like, one of the things that we didn't really maybe discuss enough about Chicago the past 2 seasons was how good they were out of dead disc scenarios with Pavlianis. I mean, him able to just shred and melt a double team at the point of contact made it so that other teams utilizing an extra defender on him was often foolish. And now all of a sudden, I think you see not necessarily throwers that lack the talent to be able to do those things, but they don't have the reps because the dude who did that for the last 5 seasons isn't there. And then sort of the player in Sam Kaminsky, who is kind of also really in charge of doing a lot of that initial movement, wasn't in the lineup, is working back from that hamstring injury. And it's just like, everything slows down from there because everything just takes a second longer. There isn't that fluidity. There isn't that like getting the disc, having it on the sideline and immediately getting it off. It's waiting an extra beat or two. It's allowing the defense to set back up. And I also had a chance to talk with Chicago head coach Dave Woods before this, and he had talked about that first game, about how they didn't do quite a good enough job of getting themselves up to game speed, about how they want to practice with more intensity and how they've been doing that the past couple of weeks. And so I expect them to head into Saturday a lot more disc out of hand. Like what you saw, I think, against Indy was a lot of disc stopping, a lot of, I'm getting the disc, I'm going to take until 5 to survey my options, and then I'm going to make a throw. But it's going to be late stall, in wind, we're a new unit. We haven't had the reps that the Union have had the past several seasons together. There just wasn't that mesh, and you could just see it. Like, everything looked very stop and go, and I think you're going to see a lot less of that. I expect a lot more of, fluid handoffs, getting the disc to the reset, and the reset distributing to a sideline, then the sideline looking continuation, and then if not, getting it back to the middle, not stopping at any one of those points. I think in talking with Woods, it became very apparent that they were very aware of what was going on with their offensive mistakes and that they have been working diligently to iron that stuff out.
Yeah, well, I hope they can. I mean, from your perspective, if you're Madison or Minnesota, who they'll play on Sunday, you look at this team and you look at some like backfield shakiness or uncertainty or inexperience, whatever you want to call it. Do you think Madison, Minnesota are going to try a lot of double team traps? Like, is that the best move to kind of rattle the Chicago offense and keep it off them?
Yeah, I think definitely right now, with them only having played 1 game heading into week 5, they still just don't have a lot of reps, a lot of live experience in the 2023 season. And so I think you just gum them up. I think you give them a lot of different looks. And again, you get them into that thinking state where they're not fluidly throwing it around. Another player that they're lacking this year is Jeff Weiss. And while I think he often has the perception of being a downfield playmaker, he's earned that reputation. He's a big boy, goes and gets the disc really well. But I think back to that game at Madison last year that the Union won. Yep. And he touched it, 40 times or something? And
Him and Shanahan both. In that game, it was like the big cutters doing most of the handling work. It was really cool. I was impressed with really like the ability for the Chicago offense to kind of shift towards these two guys that were able to take charge and just like win their matchups repeatedly.
I think they had 2 huck attempts on the entire game. I think
something like that.
The Union team was like 0 for 2 on deep looks, but they just grinded out possessions and got 21 goals at Madison, which is an accomplishment. Cool, like scoring 20 plus in Breeze means that you forced Madison out of their comfort zone. They want to keep a lid on these Central Division type matchups. That's what they're going to do in this game. But I worry about that for the Radicals. I think one of my main concerns is if Chicago figures it out offensively, with their injuries, I don't know that Radicals have the playmakers to slow down an in-rhythm Union offense. If Paul Arders
Yeah.
doesn't have another 5 throwaway game, which he won't, what happens then? Like how do you, I think, as Madison, put a lid over maybe the potential for Chicago to awaken and find out that they have all these weapons and all we needed was one kind of thrower to sort of like simmer us down and make us play more in our style, and now we figured it out. And I worry with KPS and Sterling and these other defensive starters for Madison not being available. How does Madison manage not letting maybe this game get away, or just generally sort of continuing this tradition of these road teams suddenly coming into Breese Stevens Field and taking tight games away from the Radicals, which is, again, just contributing back to some kind of this general wariness of like, hey, we won the division for 6 straight years. What's sort of happening? You know, like I wonder, like, how do the Radicals sort of stem that? How the feeling of it's happening again, you know?
Yeah.
Because I do think that
I don't know. I mean,
I think that they have a lot of confidence against Chicago, and they should. This isn't,
I think so too,
the Union of the last 2 years. This isn't Pavel Giannis being a turret and just firing in every direction, every single drive for the Union offense. You know, this is going to be different, right? And Radicals like taking advantage of different. So,
yeah. No, my last thought on Madison, I view them as a team that is just not built for defensive playmaking right now. So, like, there's not going to be a good way for them to like lean on that part of the game as their identity. What they're going to have to do is just play super efficient offense. They're going to have to keep developing those young guys. And then defensively, if you can kind of do what Indy had done last year and is doing again this year, if you can't manufacture that many break opportunities, then you just have to be like uber efficient off of turnovers. And I think Madison just has to work with what they have. But I do think their offense is going to be their best bet of winning this game.
And it's not to say that, like, I still think Madison has a great system. I think they put their players in the right places, particularly on D-line. You look at how their rails play. You look at how they take up just and sponge away the middle of the field at times. They still have that, but it's such a younger unit, and it lacks a lot of the top dogs. And so there's just a little bit of a learning curve right now. Like, I think they'll get there. Yeah. I just think that they've had maybe 2 disadvantageous matchups so far in road games where Pittsburgh has a deeper throwing lineup than anticipated, and then they had to go indoors and play an AlleyCats team that on offense with Travis Carpenter right now will just play keep away on certain drives. And when the Radicals don't have, you know, KPS flying through the reset lane to take one away and just get in the heads, and the AlleyCats are just playing catch, like, that's tough. That's tough for a young defense to overcome in the AUDL. You know, like, you need a couple of those X factor playmakers on defense who can go and take the disc away. And it's funny, you know, like, I don't know. It's one of those matchups in my head, like, how would these two teams play? You think about like Radicals right now versus like Salt Lake, who just seems to unearth dudes like that. Like, oh, look, there's another Mormon like flying at chest height to get a layout block. Like, it's just
in their culture.
Some of the personnel, the sporting disparities I think are interesting, but it's like 2 totally different defenses, and yet both I think are good in different ways. They're just taught 2 completely different systems. But anyways, that's a different tangent. We should move on to the second big Central Division matchup. The one on Sunday, Chicago again will be traveling back home after facing the Radicals in Madison on Saturday night to then host the 2-0 Minnesota Wind Chill, who might be 3-0 at that point because they will have played Detroit the night prior. So the matchup between Minnesota and Chicago will both be double headers for each team, but in one of the more wacky sort of scenarios possible. It stands to be a very important game for the 2 teams who have been battling at the top of this division for the past 2 seasons. They've met in the past 2 Central Division championship games. Obviously, the Union coming away with wins in both. This feels like a get-back game for Minnesota. This feels like a game in which the Wind Chill need to get that W. And yet, because of some of their lineup absences, I mean, no Marco Dregny, who was huge for them in Indy, no Will Brandt, no Quinn Snyder, Dylan DeClerc and Abe Coffin, both questionable with injuries, game time decisions. If Chicago suddenly finds their rhythm in Madison gets a win, and they get to go home and maybe take advantage of a Minnesota team that they've had this kind of spiritual hold over these past 2 seasons. Like, what happens for Minnesota if they've had, they're coming off this 26-12 win at home last weekend. They're hosting championship weekend at the end of this year in Minnesota and Egan. There's all this opportunity to sort of like seize the division. This is one of those years for the wind chill. And yet whenever these years happen, like in 2019 and some other times, it sort of feels like they lose hold of the rope. And I'm thinking like if Minnesota doesn't get the W this weekend, I'm worried, right? Like I'm worried that then it's just, it feeds back into, this is still the Union's division. This is still their culture of winning the past couple of years. Like, I guess my question to you is, what do you see Minnesota bringing on the road to Chicago? And the flip side of that, what do you see the Union needing to do sort of to make this weekend a success for them, to avoid going 0-3, obviously, but like, do you almost see the second matchup being more important for the Union? Or like, do you see it split either way as being kind of good because, you get a win in Breeze Stevens against Madison, put them to 0-3. That's kind of a dream scenario, I think, for a lot of Chicagoans. But like, flip side is, if you split it and get it over Minnesota, it's like you just own them. Like you just get the fact of knowing like Union own wind chill.
I feel like the Madison game is more important for Chicago because it sets the tone for that weekend. If they can come back home into that game against Minnesota after a big win on the road, like I just think that's huge. And I think if Chicago starts 0-2, and especially if the loss is by like a few goals or more, like back-to-back losses against Indy and Madison are just gonna, I just think the team morale is probably going to be pretty down. And we saw in 2021, they went on, and that was a very good Chicago team. They went on the road to Madison. I believe it was a Friday or Saturday. And then the next day came back home and played Minnesota, lost both those games. I think those were their only 2 regular season losses that year, if I'm not mistaken. So I just think the doubleheader road trip gets a lot more difficult, especially mentally, if you do drop that first game. But yeah, this Minnesota team, I don't think I'd be too worried if I were them and they lose to Chicago. This is such a shorthanded roster they're bringing. Yeah. Their only handler is Josh Klain. They don't have Jason Cheetah also. And like they've had Cheetah or Coffin or Will Brandt in all of their games alongside Klain. So this being the first game where the backfield is like totally stripped down, their downfield cutters are light too. It's just going to be like Klain to Colin Berry or Bevon basically the entire game. I mean, they do have Michael Jordan. Jordan Taylor's been playing pretty well. But yeah, this is just like Chicago a notably light
injuries too. I guess I just kind of want to stop you for a second because it's like Chicago has their injuries too. I mean, they're missing Kaminsky, they're missing Lance, they're like Goff is suffering from an injury. He might not be available. Christian Johnson hasn't made his debut this season. Like, if we're gonna kind of play the like lineup absences, like not full strength, like I think we might need to put that just slightly aside because of the magnitude of this matchup, where it is the two teams that face each other in the divisional final each year. It is like this Chicago team that keeps sort of solar plexus punching the wind chill at the end of games and running away in the fourth quarter with a whole bunch of playmaking. Like that's what they did in their 2 game of the week matchups last year. And it's just, I don't know. I feel like there's a little bit more to this game for each of these two teams than just, that was good reps. We didn't have our full strength. We'll get them next time.
Sure, but I think with Minnesota, given how well they've played in their first 2 games of the season, going to Indianapolis and then just blowing out Pittsburgh this past weekend, like I think they're the number 1 offense in the league right now from an efficiency standpoint. Their defense looks amazing. Like their defense has not missed a beat at all. I think they've leveled up too. Like Brett Bergmeyer is playing amazingly. Sam Berglund is a great asset for their D-line. Like they look like the better team. They look like the best team in the Central right now. And I think until we see Chicago, it's such a small sample size. We've only seen them in 1 game, right? So like we don't really have a good feel for either of these teams. But at this point, I'm much more confident in a full strength Minnesota than I am in a full strength Chicago. And they do play 2 more times later this season. So while I do think every Central Division game is going to be huge, especially in a pretty tightly contested playoff race, as we're assuming, I'm kind of leaning towards Minnesota being the favorite for the division right now.
Oh, I think given the, again, very small sample size and everything else to sort of make this caveat, I agree with you. I think Minnesota is the front runner right now. I'm just, again, kind of how I started the segment. It's the question of, but then what happens if you can take both these games or take one in a Minnesota game and suddenly it's, yeah, we weren't full strength, but Union keep beating us. Like, what would that be? I think that would be 5 in a row because Minnesota didn't beat Chicago.
No, Minnesota did. They did beat them in Chicago last year. It was like a 27-25.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, Colger went off at the end of the game. Like,
and they've maybe, I want to say they've beaten them like once each of the last couple seasons.
But I think going back to the 2021 Central Division title game and maybe the one matchup before that, like Chicago's won 4 of 5 or 3 of 4. I'm just saying it's tilted towards Chicago the past seasons, and just again the whole sense of here's our opportunity for Minnesota, and Chicago just kind of saying not quite yet, like
No, but, I think it would obviously be a huge win for Chicago, and it's probably going to be their best shot at beating Minnesota this season, I have to imagine, based on these rosters. So I think it's big for both teams, but probably bigger for Chicago than Minnesota.
Yeah. I mean, again, and Minnesota will be taking on the 63 losing losses in a row Detroit team the day before. So
it's an easier,
it'll probably be a win higher in the standings. They can take the loss a little bit, I think, bit more in stride at this point of the season if they're 3-0 heading into Sunday's matchup. But I want to move along. I want to move on to the Commonwealth Cup happening in the great Keystone State of Pennsylvania between the Philadelphia Phoenix, who are 0-4 coming off an overtime loss to the defending champion New York Empire. The Phoenix continuing to find creative ways to just, they were the better team throughout most of that game. They had the better playmaking. Their defense finally figured out a way to sort of unsettle and discontinue the Empire offense. They just couldn't come away with it again. So they're 0-4. They were kind of the presumptive pick to be the 3rd seed in the East, taking that final playoff spot. And yet they're winless, and they're heading on the road to face the 2-1 Pittsburgh Thunderbirds, coming off of a 14-goal loss in Minnesota, where they kind of, I think, lost all the confidence that they had built off of their first 2 wins of the season. Now they host this fired-up Phoenix team looking for any opportunity to put up a W this season. I really like this matchup. These two teams played in 2021 last. I don't think this happened last year.
Yeah,
but in 2021 they played. Pittsburgh won. It was a big highlight game. I think it was actually one of the first games where Pollard started to cross over a little bit on offense and started to showcase a little bit more of his playmaking skills around the disc and not just swatting it out of the air and as a puller on defense. It's also, I think, a really important game for two teams ostensibly fighting for the 3rd spot in both of their divisions. I think this is a very, bellwether game. Whoever wins it is going to be going this way. Whoever loses it is going to be going this way. I know I always kind of simplify things to that extent, but this has some legs to it. This matchup has finally, I think, an importance to it that hadn't been there the past several seasons when they've had this nice little interdivisional play. Mm-hmm. Do you think that Pittsburgh can refine sort of the both sides sturdiness that they had in their week 1 win against Madison? Or do you think that was more of a mirage and they're more like the team that's won only 4 games the past 2 seasons coming into 2023? And do you think Phoenix is, kind of to your player chatter article this week, the best 0-4 team ever? Like, do you think that this is finally the get-right game for Philly?
I was going to say, there were 3 separate responses of people saying Philly is the best 0-4 team ever, just from different people that chimed in this week. Look, I think I'm starting to think there is something to Pittsburgh playing at home, playing at Highmark Stadium. I really liked how they played at Madison or against Madison. I hated how they played at Minnesota. So I do think they're kind of expected to be a better home team than away team this year. And yeah, Philly's due for a win, right? Like 0-4, starting off 2 games against New York, 1 game against DC, 1-goal losses to each of those teams. Like Philly feels like the better team, and I think at this point, I I think Philly has it in them to kind of continue the momentum. I want to call it momentum of this past weekend's game against New York. I know they lost, but they took New York to overtime. They nearly blemished the perfect record that New York has had over the past 2 seasons. So I think Philly should view that as kind of something to like spark their season. I just think they're due for some wins, and the fact that their offense finally was above like a 30% conversion rate against New York, I think that bodes extremely well, and hopefully they can keep that momentum going against Pittsburgh.
I will say Philly is without 2 of their top performers on offense in Alex Thorne and the goal monster Greg Martin, who
he made so many plays against New York. Martin was
making plays on Babbitt and barking at him at the front cone. That dude has
John Randolph too.
Like about dog inside of him. I mean, he's giving up what, like 50 pounds and at least 4 inches to Jeff Babbitt, and he's just muscling him out of stuff. Martin is one of the most special players in one-on-one matchups in this league, and I continue, I think, to want Philly just like a little bit more success so he can get more of these primetime matchups, because when the moment gets bigger and the lights get brighter, he just like him and Pollard, man. Like, I know they're roommates. I know that they probably share some code with this sort of stuff, but it's phenomenal to watch them just go off against a team like New York. And New York can't do anything. You know, they're skying out John Randolph. They're out muscling Jeff Babbitt to the front cone. Like, those are the things that you don't do against New York, and yet Philly has that kind of audacity. And I think that's why they've been such good viewing in 2023, despite, you know, I don't know how else to put it, bad luck at this point. You know, the first game against New York, that was tough. That was a tough loss. But each of the last 3, it's like Philly has shown, at least for 2 to 3 quarters, like, we're the better team. We're going to win here. And it doesn't materialize into a full 4, you know, or 5.
Yeah. No, it's been a weird and frustrating year for them. But like, going from taking on the New York defense and the fact that was the game that like all of a sudden their offense was clicking for, and Pollard had a career high, 680 total yards and 8 scores. Like, going from that to now a Pittsburgh team that I think is going to be a lot easier defensively to go up against, I have a good amount of faith in Philly to keep things going and finally get in the win column. And then, like, what does that mean for Pittsburgh if they drop to 2-2? Like, are we out on them as potential playoff contenders, or is this a game that, I mean, you know, like the interdivisional games in the Central are interesting because I feel like they carry a little bit more weight given how close and like kind of back and forth the within the division games are, right?
Mm-hmm. And I mean, if Chicago drops one of their games this weekend, Chicago, Madison, Indy, and Pittsburgh would all have 2 losses already, and so it's just kind of everyone getting on the same level. I wouldn't worry about Pittsburgh. I would worry about Pittsburgh if they had another 14-goal loss. That surprised me. I know that Minnesota plays the Thunderbirds well, and I know that their defense really likes to tee off against Pittsburgh, but I didn't quite expect that laying down to the arms. Like, that would signal more of an alarm for me. But I expect a get-right game for the Thunderbirds. I think that they will perform well. Although, Philly's defense, too. I know we were just talking about the Phoenix offense getting on track. I really like the things that the Philly defense did to New York. I really thought that they frustrated them and boiled them down to just, like, Babbitt being the only option a lot of times. And, you know, there's not much you can do when New York resorts to that mode, but at least you're forcing them to that. They're not just wheeling and dealing on you. You know, they're becoming a single dimension. It just so happens that Babbitt owns that dimension because it exists in the end zone, and he lives there and is the lord of it.
It's his house. Yeah.
It's his house. It's definitely his house. Although again, Greg Martin got open on him on the front cone. Let him know about it too. Let him know. That'll do it for our general previews heading into week 5. There are a handful of other games on tap. Houston will be taking on a tough road trip at Carolina, at Atlanta. The Flyers will be operating with a lesser roster this weekend, so I'm not going to say like outright upset potential, but I'm saying if there is ever to be a crazy game that flips some of the script in the South, might be Havoc versus Flyers on Friday night tomorrow on AUDL.tv. I'm just saying, I'm just throwing
It's
that
a
out
game.
there.
It's a game to circle. It's a game to watch. Yeah, at least for
Uh,
the first half. Let's see how it goes.
Atlanta looking to get a win after their tough loss on the road at Carolina. I think that's going to be a really tough game for the Havoc. I kind of expect a full flourishing hustle offense after they only scored 15 goals in week 4.
Atlanta at home this year. I mean, those were their first 3 games of the season. Just looked unstoppable. So
they look like an all-star team. So there's that game. There's a great Canadian matchup, the second of the season between Toronto and Montreal. The first one at Claude Robillard Stadium. They had 1,200 fans for the home opener last weekend against Boston. We'll see if the Royale can continue to surge off of that momentum. Toronto, they're 1-3. Montreal, they're 0-2. So both teams kind of needing this game in order to stay in the playoff picture in the East. Although I say that, and Philly's got 4 losses. You know, Boston stands to kind of maybe a little bit. Right? We'll see. 3-0 Boston continues to be an interest to watch out in the East. They will be back in action in week 6, not this weekend, but they will be in a battle of the undefeateds with New York. Not necessarily what we expected at the top of the East Division after the first month of play, but getting aside the point, there is a Texas matchup between the Soul and the Legion, and we kind of mentioned it before, Minnesota will head to Detroit. That rounds out the Week 5 schedule. We will be coming back to you in just a couple days to recap it all, but don't forget to tune in to watch.audl.tv to check in all of the games live Friday, Saturday, and Sunday on this holiday weekend. If you're enjoying some grillables, you better be bringing a disc to that barbecue. You better be doing it. I want to see some barbecue.
Get the barbecue backends going.
I want to be like trying out the upside down throws. It's the weekend to do it. I hope you have gorgeous weather. We'll see you soon. Bye now.